Hey, welcome back to the channel. In this video, we're gonna be looking at an important philosophical concept known as subjectivism. Subjectivism is a complex idea with a number of different interpretations and applications. So in this video, we're going to try to do two things. First, we will look at one particular understanding of what subjectivism is, and then second, we will evaluate whether or not that understanding is correct. Before we begin, if you've been around for a while, then welcome back. And if this is your first time here, then please consider subscribing so that you don't miss out on any of our future videos. Now, when it comes to philosophy, there are few topics that can stir up quite as much passion as the topic of truth. For many people, the question of what is true and how we know what is true is the most important question that we can ask. And it's no wonder why. After all, how we answer this question will have a profound effect on how we live our lives. What we believe to be true affects every decision that we make and every action that we take. And so it should come as no surprise that throughout history, philosophers have devoted their entire careers to trying to solve this problem. One way to approach this question is by asking what counts as evidence for a belief. If we can figure out what counts as evidence for a belief, then we can use those criteria to determine which beliefs are true and which ones are false. On this way of thinking, the key thing about evidence is that it must be objective. By this, we mean that evidence cannot be based on personal feelings, opinions, or perspectives. This is because if evidence could be based on personal feelings, opinions, and perspectives, then everyone could claim that everything they believe is true and no one could ever be wrong. And clearly something is wrong with that. The fact of the matter is that sometimes we are right and sometimes we are wrong. And so in order for us to be right sometimes and wrong other times, there must be some way of determining which beliefs are true and which ones are false independently of our own beliefs. In other words, there must be objective reasons for believing one thing and not another. If you want more details on this argument, I recommend checking out my video on the nature of evidence. But for now, let's just assume that this argument is correct. Let's just assume that if we want to know what is true, we need to look for objective reasons for believing things. Now, there are lots of different ways of trying to find these objective reasons. For example, one might look to one's sensory experiences as evidence for what is true. Indeed, for many people, this is what they do. They look to their sensory experiences and say, well, if it seems to me that this is true, then it probably is true. However, this way of finding reasons for what is true has its own problems, namely the fact that sometimes our sensory experiences can deceive us. Sometimes what we see, hear, smell, taste, and touch does not accurately represent what is actually happening in the world. Just think of a magician as assistant who appears to be sawn in half even though she is really still completely intact. Or think of a mirage in the desert, where what you see is really just a reflection of the sky. These examples show that we cannot simply trust our sensory experiences to tell us what is true. We need some way of verifying our sensory experiences before we can use them as reasons for what is true. So maybe instead of relying on our sensory experiences, we should rely on reason instead. Maybe we should look to logic and mathematics as a source of reasons for what is true. Now, for many people, this sounds pretty good. After all, logic and mathematics seem to be completely objective. They are not based on anything subjective like personal feelings, opinions, or experiences. But unfortunately, this way of finding reasons for what is true also has its own problems. The problem is that when it comes to questions about the world, logic and mathematics alone cannot provide us with all the answers. For example, when it comes to questions about the natural world, logic and mathematics cannot tell us anything about what actually happened. They can only tell us what could happen. Think of the laws of gravity. The fact of the matter is that according to the laws of gravity, if I drop this pencil, it will fall to the ground. But that doesn't explain why it fell that way. It just tells us that it could happen that way, and the same goes for mathematics. According to the laws of mathematics, it could be the case that 2 plus 2 equals 5, but that doesn't explain why it is the case that 2 to 4. It just tells us that it could be the case that 2 plus 2 equals 5. Ultimately, when it comes to questions about the world, we need to know more than just what could happen. We also need to know what actually happened, and this is something that logic and mathematics alone cannot provide us with. Now, there are other sources of reasons that we could look to, such as testimony and historical records. But the problem with these sources is that they have their own problems. For example, there are lots of different ways that testimony and historical records can be corrupted. People can lie, cheat, steal, and destroy evidence. Historical records can be lost, destroyed, or misinterpreted. And all of this means that we cannot simply trust testimony and historical records to tell us what is true. We need some way of evaluating them before we can use them as reasons for what is true. So it looks like if we want to know what is true, we are going to need to rely on something that is both reliable and objective, something that can tell us what is true independently of our beliefs, opinions, and experiences. But there is a problem because, as far as we can tell, there is nothing like this that exists. Everything we know is based on either our sensory experiences, our reason, testimony, or historical records. And each of these sources has its own problems. There is nothing that we can appeal to that is completely reliable and objective. Well, this is where subjectivism comes in. Subjectivism is the view that there is nothing reliable and objective that we can appeal to in order to determine what is true. Instead, subjectivists say that what is true is determined by our own minds. On this view, the truth of a statement is a matter of what we believe, feel, or experience. For example, subjectivists might say that the sentence "I am in pain" is true if and only if the person making the statement is in pain. In other words, the truth of the statement is determined by the person's own experience of being in pain. Similarly, subjectivists might say that the sentence "chocolate ice cream is the best flavor" is true if and only if the person making the statement believes that chocolate ice cream is the best flavor. In other words, the truth of the statement is determined by the person's own belief about which flavor of ice cream is the best. And the reason that subjectivism is so controversial is that if it's right, then that means that there is no such thing as objective truth. There is no truth that is independent of our minds. Rather, truth is always a matter of perspective. It depends on what you believe, feel, or experience. But is subjectivism right? Well, it's hard to say. On the one hand, it is undeniable that our beliefs, feelings, and experiences play a role in determining what we take to be true. After all, we only believe what we do because we have reasons for believing what we do. And these reasons are often based on our sensory experiences, our beliefs, and our feelings. But on the other hand, to say that our beliefs, feelings, and experiences determine what is true is surely to ignore the fact that sometimes we are wrong. Sometimes our sensory experiences deceive us. Sometimes our beliefs and feelings are based on false premises. And when these things happen, we end up believing things that are not true. And so if subjectivism is right, then we must be wrong sometimes. But if we are wrong sometimes, then there must be some way of determining what is true independently of our beliefs, feelings, and experiences. And subjectivism says that there is no such way. Now, subjectivists might try to argue that this is just a misunderstanding of what they are saying. They might say that they aren't saying that we are never wrong. Instead, they might say that they are only saying that our beliefs, feelings, and experiences play a role in determining what we take to be true. But this doesn't really solve the problem, because even if subjectivists are right in this respect, it doesn't follow that there isn't some other way of determining what is true independently of our beliefs, feelings, and experiences. After all, if we are sometimes wrong, then there must be some way of determining what is true independently of our beliefs, feelings, and experiences. Otherwise, we would always be right, which we know we're not. Ultimately, then, subjectivism faces a difficult challenge. On the one hand, it is undeniable that our beliefs, feelings, and experiences play a role in determining what we take to be true. But on the other hand, subjectivism's denial of objective truth seems to imply that we are never wrong, and we know that we are sometimes wrong. And so, unless subjectivists can find a way to explain how we can be wrong sometimes without giving up the idea that truth is a matter of perspective, subjectivism will continue to face this difficult challenge. That's it for this week's video. If you enjoyed the video, please remember to leave a like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. See you next time.